Okay, so lots of discussion here about behaviour change. So it's a question about how do we change behaviour around energy consumption at the local level? Do we use economic incentives or do we use other means? And then another question about what legislation would the panel like to see in place at the local and national level?
Marvellous, thank you very much. Behaviour change coming up again, I notice. We've had a lot of that over the last years.
So the first question we have is around viability of using mixed methods in one space. So for example, having a solar panel in a field which is also used for biodiversity and also used for farming. And then also this one I think goes mainly to Chris. Can there be preferential rates negotiated when buying in bulk in terms of purchasing solar panels?
That's not the first time we've been asked about how much these things cost.
We have a technical question, and that's where does biomass fit into renewables, and is it actually renewable? And then a second rather lengthy question, and again it's very much about behaviour change. So how do we get people to change energy sources, for example, cheaper gas to more expensive electricity? And what is the potential role of carbon pricing in changing people's behaviour? For example, if we put solar panels on every possible roof space in Oxford, how much impact would it have on energy demands? And then a nice simple question, what's the cheapest energy source?
We're in a schedule, which is why I'm letting everyone have more than one question.
So we've also got two. The first one is a question about how much carbon emissions would be reduced if we put solar panels on every roof that we can. Some Assembly members on this table did some sums. They thought it worked out about 5% of our of the total. Is that worth it? Is an alternative better? The second question is, should my 11-year-old invest his money in a social impact bond issued by the City Council or the government? He has £270 in the bank.
It's a very, very specific question. Glenn.
Right, we were fortunate enough to have Chris sit down with us and had all our solar panel questions answered. So thank you, Chris. This one's probably for Nick, but probably should open it up to the full panel. It's simply, what is the boldest achievable vision in time frame to convert to 100% renewable energy?
How long have you got?
You stole my question. Okay, so the other question we had, which is probably for the council, is how invested are council pensions in fossil fuels?
Turned into a game show. Who wants to go first? It feels like that boldest achievable vision thing might be a worthwhile place to start. Anyone? No one? Have a go.
I mean, obviously,
It depends.
the problem about thinking about the future is that we have no evidence about the future. We're based solely on the past. I would say that the 2050 ambition set out by the Committee on Climate Change and accepted by the government is pretty ambitious. I think if you pushed really hard, 2040 might look just about doable. I think anything closer than that, I personally think would be very difficult, particularly to decarbonise heating and industry, which are areas we haven't really talked about in great detail.
We turn the energy system upside down so that we are meeting as much of our energy needs as possible, as close as possible to where it is generated, and that is generated by renewables. And then that means that we, you all know what a substation sort of basically is. We're trying to work behind the substation as far as possible. And that means that we're all incentivised to do as much as possible to our own places in order to reap the benefits of doing that. And that might incentivise landlords to do something too, so that we can trade that energy peer-to-peer, and so that we can be given an energy budget. And if we go beyond that, we're deemed to have gone up a step from the substation at our local area to the primary substation, and we are charged an arm and a leg for doing that, so that we get into a position where we are really disbenefiting the people who are richest and most guzzling of energy already. And I think that so it's all about how we change regulation in order to incentivise that sort of behaviour, but there's no point doing that unless we, as part of that package, we are really given an incentive to reduce our demand as far as possible. And just to give you an example of what has been possible in my own house, we use just under 6,000 kilowatt hours, so just under 6,000 units of energy, all of which is electricity because of the way that we refurbished our house, and that is quite a lot less than the normal household, which would use about 15,000 units for space heating and another 3,500 for power. So that's the bold vision: turn the energy system upside down.
And I think in order to do that, you have to work through who is paying for what, so that the people who have, at the present time, the greatest need for energy, for health or other reasons, are not penalised inadvertently through something we do for to reduce climate emissions, and also so that those who can plough their own resources into getting to the best and most efficient system don't have a disproportionate gain from those people who don't have their own resources to plough in. So there's a very big network of thinking to be done to see how we get there.
And then, yeah, I think my view of a boldest achievable vision would be actually perhaps less about technology and what technologies we deploy, but really how we deploy that, particularly in terms of equity. I think this kind of transition is an opportunity to sculpt our city into a form that we would like to see, and I think certainly on the renewable energy supply, I don't think it has too much of an impact on what our city looks like. I do think things like provision of electric vehicle charging infrastructure across the city could really change our urban form and what our town looks like. Are we going to have a charging point outside every house? Are we going to have hubs of car shared vehicles that people can just dip in and use, and the rest of the roads are opened up for kids to play in, and pedestrians and cyclists and so forth? So I think there's some quite bold things that you can do, but a lot of it relates to how you want to shape a city and who has access to these clean high-tech services.
So biomass is usually considered to be a renewable energy source, but there are a lot of debates about the exact conditions under which it is a renewable. There's quite a lot of I showed the slide that says 12% of our energy comes from renewables. Quite a lot of that is biomass in wastes from different sources, providing heating, but also in wood pellets that are shipped from the United States of America to be burnt in formerly coal-fired power stations, and so there's some real questions about whether that's a sensible thing to do. In general, in this country, we are quite a crowded, small country compared to many others. If we were having this debate in Norway, we might be able to say yes, we can get all the energy we need from biomass, and that will not be a problem. In this country, that's not going to be the case, which is why I think there is much more focus on wind and solar here.
And just to follow up on that, it is all about using the resource that each country has in the wisest way. And the UK, you know, we had lots of coal, and we used, you know, that fired the Industrial Revolution. We've got an amazing resource of renewable energy, quite apart from the fact that solar turns out to be much more viable in this country than we thought at the beginning. Temperature's actually good for solar in a funny sort of way. We've also got the best wind resource, I think, in Europe. And because we're on the very edge of the continental shelf, offshore wind is really viable for us to put in. And wouldn't it be good if we could exploit the best tidal range in the world by producing tidal energy as well? But that's probably a debate for another day. So the sort of energy, the system that we're thinking about and the bold vision for it is all about using your indigenous resources most wisely. And why would that not be a business as usual no-brainer anyway?
Isabella's table had a question about legislation.
Legislation at local and national level. We need some serious change to the way that the energy system is regulated. It is really heavily regulated, so to make sure that the lights stay on, or increasingly these days our mobile phones don't die, predictably and without the system falling over and without us overloading it so it blows up every now and again, although we did see an example of that almost a bit over the summer. And there's about, my understanding is about 10,000 pages of rules about how we run our energy system. Those need to be very much simplified and made much easier for us normal people to understand and be involved with.
Anyone else want to go with that one?
So as I indicated in the initial presentation I gave, I think there is a strong role for national government. I think I'd put it into three broad categories. One is standards and regulation, not just in the electricity industry, as Barbara's been talking about, but basic things like building standards, product standards, standards for cars. All those have been used very effectively, and just there is a risk that the legal framework for appliances and cars will end on the 31st of October. I won't say any more about that, but we actually need a legal framework for that. The other, I think there's general acceptance that you need not just product standards, but you need incentives. I know people have had specific discussions about solar incentives, but that would apply to building refurbishment and wind energy and all sorts of other things. And the third area where government has got a role is in doing what we're doing today, actually, which is trying to engage people in a discussion, because in a democracy, decisions have to be made in a way that people will accept, and if government doesn't participate and lead that debate, it's difficult for other people to do it.
Can I build on the standards idea and shamelessly picking up from the table I was sitting with, that building standards are essential to embed the sort of energy efficiency that we need, but we also need to recognise that I think it is still the case that the majority of our housing was built before the First World War. So we need to recognise that there needs to be support for bringing that building housing stock up to standard, and in those areas where the building stock is rented for housing, then we need to be really clear that landlords need to be required to provide housing stock that is efficient and effective.
There was a question back up at one of these tables about green gas.
What is green gas? Someone mentioned green gas.
So people talk about two sorts of green gas. Like all simple questions, it has a complicated answer. The first is gas that's produced biologically, so it's a form of biomass. So you can get it out of things like anaerobic digesters from wet waste. It's essentially a way of using biomass. The second area of green gas that's increasingly being talked about is hydrogen, so making hydrogen from green electricity. So it's just a way of turning green electricity into green gas, and that would allow, in principle, then allow you to go on using gas in a way that wouldn't emit carbon dioxide, because hydrogen doesn't contain any carbon. So that's one of the massive debates about infrastructure and overall strategy that is still unresolved, and really only can be resolved at a national level.
One of the other things we were talking about was getting people to change from one source of energy to another. So there's a question this table up at the back here wanted to ask, which is around how do we get people to change energy sources, particularly from gas to electricity? How do you actually do that?
Yeah, I think within the city, I think that's less likely to be too much of an issue, because I would imagine that all homes have access to electricity, and by far in excess of 95% of them, I would imagine, would be on the gas network, if not all of them. So we have a situation within the city where our infrastructure is already doubled up in terms of supply to the home. So the question then would really be about people's individual heating systems within the home. Are you going to replace a gas boiler with a heat pump that runs off of electricity with a view to saving carbon and maybe money? Or are you going to replace your gas boiler with another gas boiler and perhaps hope that gas itself cleans itself up with the addition of green gas into that? It's a very, very tricky decision, I think, particularly about replacing boilers with heat pumps, mainly because heat pumps can be comparatively expensive. They are about 3 times more efficient than gas boilers. But electricity costs about 3 times what gas does, so the financial saving isn't necessarily there.
And I think that's the big challenge from the table here, is
there's no clear driver, and that's sort of where incentives and/or regulation might help. But until those are in place, there's no real sort of clear strategy for homeowners to adopt in terms of thinking about what they are going to do next with their heating system. I'll just add one more thing, which is most people replace their heating system when their heating system breaks. So it tends to be a panic purchase, or you just go see your local plumber and you end up being given what they want to install. So unless you're actually pre-planned as to what you are going to have next time your boiler breaks, you may not even end up down a desirable route anyway.
One of our questions was, which I just hope we could get to, is what the panel could comment on the potential role of carbon pricing in changing people's behaviour.
Clearly that sort of thing does make a difference. I mean, I think we just need to think back over the time that the feed-in tariff was around, and at the beginning of that we were installing what now seem laughably small systems and didn't really know how to do it. Well, Chris did, but anyone else didn't. And over the course of the sort of 8 or 9 years that the feed-in tariff was there, it made a radical difference to, alongside with happenstance, China getting ramped up with production. It's made a huge difference to the possibility of putting solar panels. So I don't think we should let national government off the hook here. What their decisions are really material in this area. In terms of what we do in the city, Chris is quite right. Just about everywhere is on the gas grid and is connected to the electricity network. Sort of links into what's the cheapest energy source, because obviously the cheapest energy source is not needing to use the energy. And so it's all about, at the moment, at this point in our cycle of change, it's about persuading people that changing their behaviour and changing their decisions to reduce their energy demand is the best and cheapest and most effective thing that they could possibly do. And why would they do that? And the work that we've been doing at the Low Carbon Hub would suggest that you don't talk about retrofitting and energy efficiency. You talk about comfort and healthiness and a nice place to live in. And then it becomes a bit of a no-brainer to make sure that your building is the nicest and healthiest place that you could bring your children up in, or house your elderly people in, or whatever. And so getting the right set of, the right way of talking about it with the right support to do what otherwise, as Chris says, becomes a panic purchase, with the right leadership. And I do think that what locally we should be asking the city to do is to continue with their undoubted leadership role in this area already and add to that and put some thought into how they can add to that leadership role in a way that will help us all to make those decisions and support us in making those decisions. One table was talking about could you have a sort of council tax rebate if your house was brilliantly insulated and very low energy demand. I know that's been discussed a lot over the last 10 years or so, and I don't know the ins and outs of it. Wouldn't that be great?
A couple of questions from the table up at the back here.
Sorry, can I just add
go
one more thing on carbon pricing? I think carbon pricing is quite a tricky piece of policy to do, and by carbon pricing, I'm assuming that you're essentially imagining some kind of carbon tax where you would essentially tax carbon emissions. The danger of it is that it's quite good at reducing demand, certainly amongst the middle class. These are people who are well off enough and well educated enough to make good responses. The very rich, however, are not price sensitive. Okay, so the very, very big users probably aren't going to respond to any kind of price increase because it doesn't touch the size of their wallets. The poor, however, would then be left between a choice of heating and eating. Right? So from an equity point of view, carbon pricing, I think, is very, very problematic unless you can find some way of sort of squaring that circle and ensuring that we've all got, it's something you might be able to do once everyone has got a well-insulated home. But until that point, I think it's a little bit dangerous.
Great. One of the questions up the back was, what actually would be the impact of sticking solar panels on every house? Like how much reduction in emissions would that actually result in?
So that's probably one for me. So I think an average size solar roof, and obviously they are variable in size, an average size solar roof would produce around about half the average house's electricity needs. Okay, so it would save you half of the carbon footprint from your electricity. Okay,
can I just challenge that a little bit? Is that assuming people are using a mix of electricity and gas, or is that assuming?
That's assuming national average electricity usage. Okay, so you'd be saving about a tonne from that, from a typical kind of 2 tonnes from your electricity usage. In terms of your overall carbon footprint, you're probably adding another 2 tonnes for your heating and another 2 tonnes for your travel. Okay. So from your direct emissions, you'll be saving 1 tonne out of 6. Okay. We then probably need to look at your lifestyles as well, and the average person's carbon impact is probably around about 12 tonnes in total. That extra stuff comes from the carbon embedded in your food, in your clothes, in your laptops, in everything you buy, in your stuff. Okay, so you might be saving 1 tonne out of 12 in total.
I'd largely agree with those numbers. I'd just make one point which follows from what Chris has said, that I think it would be a mistake to say because it's only 1 tonne in 6 or 1 tonne in 12, it's not very important, because everything is only 1 tonne in 6 or 1 tonne in 12 or even smaller. One of the problems with this debate is that there is no magic bullet solution. It will need a lot of different things, a lot of different actions. So 1 in 6 is pretty good in my book.
And I think I would link it back to what I imagine Miles Allen was talking about yesterday in terms of intergenerational equity, and what Asaf from War on Want was talking about yesterday as well, about equity between the developed north and the global south. And my understanding is that every single tonne of carbon saved means that our grandchildren don't have to spend proportionately enormous amounts of money to scrub that out of the atmosphere. And that sort of view of the world links for me to the answer on the 11-year-old with their £270 to invest in a social impact bond with the City Council. Well, clearly it needs to be invested in the shares of the Low Carbon Hub. But what I would say there is that a lot of the investors in the Low Carbon Hub are older people. And yes, our demographic is, I think our average age of investor is about 65. And we deal with quite a few probates every year. But the demand from that demographic, which I think needs to be strongly encouraged, is that how can we make it easiest for them to invest on behalf of their grandchildren? And so I would be saying, I don't think the 11-year-old should be putting their £270 into a social impact bond, although it would be a great thing to do because it would earn them money. Their grandparents ought to be putting 16 times that into the Low Carbon Hub. So we need to be thinking about not just how we deal with that intergenerational inequity around carbon, but also about those intergenerational inequities around who has the money. And my proposition to you is that we can solve both by investing in this stuff now.
We had one final question that I would like to address, which is, I think it was your table, Nick, about council pensions and fossil fuels. I think Tom's got an answer for that. Yeah, sure.
Hello. So there are 2 councils that operate over Oxford. There's Oxford City and there's Oxfordshire County. Since 2014, Oxford City is committed to not investing in fossil fuel companies. So to give you that reassurance. Oxfordshire County Council are a part of the Oxfordshire Pension Fund. That's a separate question. So on the 6th of September, there was a meeting of the Oxfordshire Pension Fund to decide how to take forward its commitment to environmental goals. There'll be a workshop on the 9th of November. I'm pushing for that to include people who are in favour of fossil fuel divestment, as well as those in favour of engagement with fossil fuel companies. And that will be a place where some of these key decisions are discussed. I think there's 3 things to bring out, though, and I've made these clear to the pension fund. The first is that the environmental responsibilities of the pension fund do not sit outside of the climate emergency declaration called by the county council. It's a part of it. The second is to say that there's actually very good growing evidence to say that in continuing to invest in fossil fuel companies is harmful for your investment. So the Morgan Stanley Composite Index of global stocks shows that investing in fossil fuel companies can actually lead to underperformance. And that's what Islington Borough Council have cited when they fully divested from fossil fuels. And then the third thing to say is around engagement. You'll hear from the pension fund that engagement with these fossil fuel companies is the way to get them to change their behaviours. But actually, BP and Shell have got a model of extraction which makes profits. They don't need to have engagement in order to change their ways. They need engagement with milestones and targets and so on. And so the pension fund workshop will hopefully try to include some of those targets and milestones. It's really important because the pension fund sits within a larger fund which is worth £23 billion.
Great, thank you very much.
Can I just make a suggestion that maybe Oxford County Council invest in Barbara's low carbon hub?
Okay. Barbara gets a right response to that.
Yeah, I think we should be really encouraged that both the City Council and the County Council have been talking to and working with the Low Carbon Hub for a long time. And the Low Carbon Hub wouldn't be here unless the City Council had worked very closely with us on getting grant funding in the early days that only the City had access to. So we have a short-term construction fund with the City Council that allows us to build things and then raise money from local people to buy out that loan. And it's a brilliant way of helping us. And both the city and the county continue to think about how they might make longer term investments in the low carbon hub. So please rest assured that they're working very actively and creatively with us on that. I'm sure that can only be supported by you guys asking them to do it more. One thing, just following on from what Tom was saying about pension funds, I was at a little private dinner that a big cheese from Oxford University set up with people who have control over many billions of investment pounds. And it was Chatham House rules, so I can't name anybody. But the thing that was really, really interesting for me in that was that those people were willing to talk about how we do business as usual capitalism quite differently than I expected them to. And so they are expecting regulation to come at them which will make them change how they do things, and in fact they actively want that to happen, and they want to find ways of investing at much smaller scales than they normally do, because normally that sort of pension fund doesn't get out of bed for less than £100 million of investment, and unfortunately we're not quite there yet. So I do think that the sort of work that Tom was talking about is absolutely critical to this. You can keep demanding that change, and if local authority pension funds are changing the way that they operate, that might prove models that can help national government to legislate in ways that require investment funds to operate in a different way. So my understanding is that requirements to have an environmental outcome from investment as well as a shareholder benefit or a pensioner benefit outcome is already changing behaviour. If we could really ratchet up on that and include social benefits, that will force change on enormous sums of investment that might help us to do what we want to do here.
Great, thank you very much. It is now a break, I think. If we can be back at about 1:45, but a quick round of applause for the panel there.